Hello there, friend. You're here now. The world has quieted for a little while. You've done so much today, and now you can let it all go. Let your shoulders fall, your jaw relax, your breath settle into a soft, even rhythm. Tonight, let's take a slow, quiet journey into the past, to a time when the snow fell thick and the days were short, when people lived by candlelight and homes were warmed by fire and heart. We're going to drift back to the 17th and 18th centuries, to the American colonies, where ordinary people faced long, icy winters with calm, grit, and hope. This isn't a story of war or drama. No loud battles, no booming declarations. Just the hush of snow against wooden shutters, the creak of floorboards under woolen socks, the scent of stewed apples and burning oak. We'll visit kitchens and hearths, farms and frozen rivers, spinning wheels and handmade mittens. And as we walk through time together, your body can rest. Your mind can wander gently. You are safe here. You are warm here. Somewhere far off, a church bell chimes once, then all is still. In the autumn months, colonial families began their slow preparations for winter. They didn't have central heating, or supermarkets, or electric blankets. They had planning, and patience, and a deep, ancient rhythm that tied their lives to the turning of the year. As the leaves turned to copper and gold, and the harvest came in, families stored away apples, squash, and salted meats. Cabbages were packed into barrels with salt for long fermentation. Corn was dried and ground into meal. The smell of smoke drifted from every chimney. Not sharp, but soft, like hickory and maple and sweet old wood. Children carried baskets of kindling. Women spun thick yarn by hand. Men chopped cords of firewood until their backs ached and their sleeves were stiff with frost. Inside, they lined the walls with woolen quilts, patched and repatched with loving hands. Every blanket had a story, some made from old coats, some stitched with prayers. The floors were swept. Herbs were hung from beams, and candles, dipped from beeswax or tallow, were stored in wooden drawers. Nights came earlier and earlier. The sun, gentle and low, slanted through the tiny panes of wavy glass. The wind began to whisper against the doors, and everyone knew winter was on its way. One quiet morning, the first snow would come, not in a storm, but gently, softly, like a secret passed from cloud to ground. The world outside would slow to stillness. No birdsong, no clatter of carts, just snow, falling thick and silent. Inside, someone would say, "It's begun." Children pressed their faces to the glass. Their breath made little clouds. And beyond the panes, the fields were vanishing under a white, downy blanket. Fires were stoked higher. Kettles boiled. In every cabin, hearths became the center of life. The glow of embers. The slow simmer of stew. The pop and crackle of wood releasing its stories into the air. The smell of cloves and cinnamon floated through the rooms, from cider warming in iron pots. Chores didn't stop, but they became slower, softer. Fetching water meant breaking a thin sheet of ice from the bucket. Carrying feed to the chickens meant brushing snow from the coop. There were mittens knit from homespun wool, scarves wrapped twice around the neck, boots dried by the fire overnight. And after supper, always eaten early, there was silence. Sometimes, stories were told in low voices. Sometimes, there was only the sound of the wind nudging gently against the shutters. It was cold, but it was never lonely, because they had each other, and they had the fire. Evenings were long. The sun set early, sometimes before the supper dishes were cleared. Candles were precious, so people gathered near the hearth, the only real light and warmth in the house. In one corner, someone might shell beans into a wooden bowl. In another, a child traced their finger through dust on the windowsill, drawing stars or birds or letters they were learning. Wool socks hung from a drying rack above the fire. A cat might stretch in a patch of warmth on the stone floor, its tail twitching in its sleep. The fire hissed softly. People spoke less in winter. Not from sadness, but from peace. Words were used carefully. Stories were slow, meandering. Like this one, perhaps a tale about a bear in the woods, or a cousin who once caught frostbite and survived, or how grandmother used to keep warm with bricks wrapped in flannel under the covers. They laughed gently, smiled often, slept early. Sleep came easier then. The body knew when to rest. And outside, the wind sang through the bare trees. Not fierce, just there, just present, and always the fire burned. Even in winter, there was work to be done. The cold didn't stop the animals from needing care. The hens still needed feed. The cows still needed milking. The woodpile still needed stacking. And so, each morning, someone would bundle up, layers of linen and wool and thick mittens tied with yarn, and step outside into the snow. The door creaked softly. Snow crunched beneath heavy boots. Breath rose in soft, foggy puffs into the morning air. The sky often looked washed out, gray or pale blue, like old porcelain. Frost clung to every surface. Fence rails glittered. Bare branches shimmered like glass. Even the barn door had a crust of sparkling white along the edges. In the barn, it was warmer. Not warm, exactly, but quieter. The breath of animals steamed in the cold air. Hooves shifted gently on hay-covered floors. There was the smell of straw, of leather, of grain. Buckets clinked. Water sloshed. And far off, a crow cawed once, before the silence folded back in. When the chores were done, hands numb and cheeks red, they returned to the house. The fire welcomed them. Stew had thickened. A pie might be cooling on the windowsill. The scent of apples and nutmeg made the whole house feel like a storybook. And for a while all was still. Indoors, winter was the time for hands to stay busy. Women sat by the fire, baskets at their feet filled with yarn, scraps of cloth, or thread on wooden spools. Some spun flax into linen. Others repaired coats with thick stitches. Some embroidered flowers onto pillowcases or initials onto napkins that would be used at Easter. Fingers moved slowly, calmly. The work was never rushed. Each stitch was careful. Each thread chosen with care. There were no machines. Just the whisper of cloth against skin, the creak of a chair, the soft murmur of someone humming an old tune under their breath. Children played nearby with wooden toys or dolls made from leftover fabric. Sometimes they were taught to help, to card wool or wind yarn. Their small fingers learned the rhythm. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and old cedar. On the windowsill, a sprig of dried lavender rested in a small, chipped cup, its color faded, but its scent still lingering. Outside, snowflakes tapped gently against the glass. Inside, the fire cracked once. And the rhythm of winter work continued, not as a chore, but as comfort. Food in the winter was simpler, slower, and meant to last. Breakfasts were hot and hearty, often cornmeal mush or oat porridge, sweetened with molasses if there was any. Sometimes apples were stewed with cinnamon, or bread was toasted on a long fork near the fire. The kettle always stayed warm. It made tea when there were leaves, or just hot water with herbs when there weren't. Lunch, if it was had at all, might be bread and cheese, or a bit of smoked meat left from the autumn butchering. But it was dinner that brought people together. Thick soups, stews made from root vegetables and beans, biscuits baked in the hearth's iron Dutch oven. The smells were warm before the food was. They filled the house long before the meal was served. There was a reverence in the way meals were eaten. Slowly, gratefully, with hands washed and heads bowed. No noise, no screens, no schedules. Just the creak of a wooden spoon against a bowl, the soft scrape of chairs pulled close, and the shared warmth of full stomachs in a cold world. Afterward, someone might peel apples by the fire, the peel falling in one long red curl into a waiting bowl. And outside, the stars blinked awake, quiet, watchful, and kind. As night deepened, so did the quiet. Some nights, there was no sound at all except the sigh of the wind and the fire's gentle pop. Others, someone might read aloud. Books were few, often only one or two in a home. A Bible, perhaps, or an almanac, or a collection of stories handed down for years. The voice would be low, calm, even. Others would listen with eyes closed, letting the words fill the space like a warm quilt. Sometimes they told stories instead. Family stories, fables, old country tales about brave animals or clever children or spirits in the woods. The stories weren't told to teach, not always. Sometimes they were just for being together. And when the flames burned low, someone would add a final log. Blankets were pulled tight, shoes placed near the fire to dry, candles snuffed with a quiet puff of breath. Then slowly, they made their way to bed, up narrow stairs to a loft, or across the room to a curtained bed. The mattresses were sacks of straw, shifted into place with care. Blankets were heavy, layered, hand-stitched. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the eaves. Inside, sleep came softly, and the long winter night held them close. In the deepest part of winter, time moved differently. There were no clocks ticking loudly, no loud alarms, no schedule tied to screens or meetings. Time was marked by sunlight and snow, by the low arc of the winter sun and the long, slow shadows it cast across wooden floors. People woke when the fire needed tending, slept when the oil ran low, ate when their bellies asked them to. They measured time by chores, by the steeping of tea, by how long it took a log to burn down to glowing red coals. Sometimes a whole day might pass with little said, not out of loneliness, but out of contentment. There was a rhythm to winter days, the same chores, the same walks, the same fire, the same soft sigh of wind through the trees. It didn't feel repetitive. It felt steady. There was comfort in knowing what each day would bring, in the way the world slowed down without asking permission. And if snow fell, it was like the day wrapped itself in an extra layer of silence. The quiet was never empty. It was full of flickering light, of rustling fabric, of slow thought of presence. On rare afternoons, when the sun peeked through thin clouds and the wind calmed for a while, neighbors visited. They came wrapped in cloaks and shawls, mittens layered over gloves, cheeks rosy from the walk through snow. Sometimes a child was pulled along on a wooden sled. At the door, boots were knocked against the frame. Snow brushed from sleeves. And then the warmth. A warm house always smelled like something. Cinnamon, smoke, wool, bread. Visitors were offered tea, or hot cider, or sometimes just hot water with dried mint and honey. Conversations were slow and circular, never rushed. They talked about small things, how the chickens were faring, whether the creek was frozen through, if someone's roof needed patching come spring. Children played quietly underfoot, sliding carved animals along the floor. Stories were shared. Advice was given in the softest tones. Laughter came like a warm breeze. When it was time to go, it was always gently. Coats pulled on again. A little warmth carried home. And afterward, the house felt fuller, even after the door had shut. Not louder, just fuller, like the walls had absorbed the comfort of company. Though winters were hard, they weren't joyless. In many homes, there were small celebrations that made the cold feel less heavy. The end of December brought gatherings, not loud or lavish, but meaningful. Some marked Christmas with quiet reverence. Others simply took joy in the light returning, in days beginning, ever so slightly, to grow longer again. Children were told stories about animals kneeling in barns at midnight, or about stars that guided travelers across snow and sand. Evergreen boughs might be brought inside, not full trees, but small branches placed above doorways or over the hearth. Oranges, if they had them, were prized. Dried apples strung into garlands. A candle might be lit for someone remembered. There were no fireworks, no fanfare, just quiet gratitude. Sometimes small gifts were made, a carved whistle, a stitched bonnet, a poem inked carefully on rough paper. The joy wasn't loud, but it was deep, and it lingered long after the candles were snuffed. Because what they celebrated was not escape from the cold, but the light within it, a hope that stayed kindled in the quietest places. Some nights, when the snow was fresh and the clouds had parted, the moon made the world glow. It lit up the fields like silver velvet. Shadows stretched softly along fences and trees. Ice shimmered on rooftops. Even the branches seemed dusted with light. Inside, the moonlight spilled through wavy glass onto the floor. A family might gather near the window, just to watch. Not to do anything, just to be. To see how the world changed when bathed in that quiet silver. Sometimes older children would sneak out for a walk, boots crunching over untouched snow, breath rising like mist, their lantern swinging gently, casting long shadows. They would return soon after, cheeks glowing, hearts filled with something they couldn't quite name. It was wonder, maybe, or reverence, or just the soft awe of winter. Back inside, someone stirred in their sleep. The fire sighed as a log settled, and somewhere, a barn owl called once before the silence returned. The moonlight lingered a little while longer. Then slowly, it too began to fade. In the stillness of winter, sometimes illness would come. A cough that lingered, a fever that rose in the night, a child too quiet, curled in blankets near the hearth. There were no hospitals, no doctors nearby. Only what one could do at home, with hands and heart and old knowledge passed down. Herbs were steeped into tea, dried mint for a sore throat, willow bark for pain, elderberry boiled into syrup. A cloth soaked in vinegar might be placed on a warm forehead. Spoons of honey were given slowly, not just for the throat, but for comfort. The sick were kept close to the fire, blankets piled high, socks warmed on iron pegs. Soft whispers replaced laughter. A rocking chair moved gently back and forth, as someone hummed a lullaby that had no words. People didn't fear illness the way we might now. They accepted it, not without sadness, but with quiet steadiness. They believed in rest, in time, in warmth. And often, after some days, the worst would pass. The cough would ease, color returned to the cheeks, and the house would exhale, softly, with relief. The soup tasted better that night. The fire felt warmer, the whole room brighter, and sleep came grateful and deep. For children, winter was both quiet and magical. Without schools in session, and with long days indoors, their worlds became small but full. In the mornings, they might help with chores, sweeping, gathering eggs, drying dishes. Their boots lined neatly near the door, scarves hung to dry. But the afternoons were often their own. They built towns from scraps of wood, played games with stones and chalk, wrote letters on slate boards with careful hands. In the corners, they whispered stories to each other, tales of wolves in the woods, of lost travelers, of brave little mice who lived in the walls. Dolls were dressed and redressed. Stitched animals were given names and personalities. Older children read aloud when they could, or practiced their letters with ink that froze if left too long. Sometimes they just sat near the fire and watched the way the flames moved. Evenings were quieter still, hands tucked under blankets, heads resting on parents' shoulders. Sometimes an adult told them stories, not of princes and dragons, but of real winters past, when the snow had reached the top of the fence, when the pond had frozen solid. Their eyes widened, then softened, as sleep began to pull them under. Even in winter, plants played a quiet, steady role. Though the garden beds were frozen, the work of herbs wasn't done. In pantries and drawers, in bundles hanging from rafters, lay the careful harvests of warmer months: dried mint, chamomile, sage, yarrow, thyme. Each had a purpose. Each had a memory. Mint leaves were steeped for headaches. Sage was brewed for sore gums. Chamomile helped with sleep, especially when steeped in warm milk. Rose hips, collected after the first frost, were simmered for their strength, tart and bright, and full of something that felt like sunlight. Even onion was medicine, cut and placed near the bed to pull out fevers, or cooked slowly with broth for those who could barely eat. People trusted what they had, trusted what they'd learned, trusted the way their mothers and grandmothers and neighbors had done things before them. It was not science, not always, but it was care, hands reaching for warmth. Thoughtfulness passed through generations. Sometimes, the smell of rosemary filled the house, sharp, clear, comforting. Other times, it was lavender, tucked in a pillow, or crumbled into water for washing. These herbs were more than medicine. They were memory and ritual and hope. When the wind howled outside, and the snow made the world still, many turned inward. They wrote. Letters were a precious thing, even if there was no one to send them to yet. They were written with ink made from soot or walnut, on rough, fibrous paper, with careful, slanted script. Dear cousin, the snow is thick today. It comes sideways against the glass, and I think of your stories of storms back home. People wrote to sisters they hadn't seen in years, to friends across the sea, to parents long gone. Some wrote journals instead, quiet reflections kept private, notes about the weather, about the stew, about a dream, sometimes a single sentence. January 9th. The fire was difficult to keep. My back aches. But the light was pretty at supper. Words were not for publishing, not for likes or replies. They were for remembering. The way the fire looked one evening. The first snow. The sound of sleet against the roof. In the silence of long nights, the scratch of quill against paper was a kind of music. And in those pages, smudged and yellowing, lived a kind of forever. In the depth of winter, there was still faith. Not loud sermons or grand cathedrals, but quiet belief, folded gently into daily life. A simple blessing before meals. A whispered prayer while tending the fire. A hymn hummed softly while folding clothes. Faith in winter was like the light from a candle, small, flickering, yet unwavering. It was the kind that wrapped around you, not the kind that demanded to be seen. On Sundays, if roads were clear, families might travel together to a meeting house. The walk was quiet. Snow muffled everything except the crunch of boots and the breath rising from mouths like smoke. Inside, the benches were plain, the fire minimal, and yet it was warm in spirit. Heads bowed, hands folded, eyes closed, or gazing softly ahead. Not always with words. Sometimes silence was the prayer, the kind that said, I'm here. I'm listening. I'm grateful. And even at home, if weather kept them in, families gathered around the hearth. A verse might be read from the one family Bible. A child might recite something learned by heart. Then silence again. The good kind. The kind that feels like trust. On the clearest nights, when the clouds drifted away and the moon kept its distance, the stars became their own kind of fire. Colonial skies, free from electric lights, revealed everything. The stars were thick and endless. Pale gold, silver, blue. Each one steady. Each one old. Sometimes after supper, someone would step outside, wrap a shawl tighter, and just look. Their eyes adjusted slowly. The Milky Way was a river above the barn roof. Orion's belt stood proud above the trees. And if you watched long enough, you might see a slow-falling star. Children were taught the names, the stories behind them. And even if they forgot the names, they remembered the feeling, the stillness, the wonder, the reminder that the world was vast, but safe. Some people tracked the stars with care, noting which ones rose earlier in January than in December. Others simply let the sight of them settle in their chest like a warm stone. And then, once the cold began to bite, they'd go back inside, cheeks pink, heart full. Back to the fire. The blankets. The familiar scent of wood smoke. But part of them still drifting upward. Winter lingered, but it didn't last forever. And one day, slowly, quietly, the first sign would come. A single drip from the eaves, steady as a heartbeat. A crow cawing differently, not the cold cry of December, but something brighter. A patch of mud where snow had once held tight. These were the signs the old ones knew well. The hints that the deep stillness was shifting. Inside, people smiled more easily. Lingered at the door a little longer. A few windows cracked open, just for a moment, to let in air that no longer bit quite so hard. Sap began to rise in the trees. In some places, maple tapping began. A tin pail hung from a spout, catching drops of sweetness from the trunk. Children watched them form. Each drop a promise. The days were still cold. Nights still sharp. But the light changed. It stretched further. It softened. It reached into corners that had been dark for months. And though no flowers had bloomed yet, hope had. Not loudly. Not suddenly. Just enough to remind them. Life was beginning again. What carried them through the winter was not just firewood or food. It was each other. It was the way someone always rose first to light the fire. The way mittens were mended without being asked. The way bread was shared when someone had less. It was the soft glance between two people who had known each other for 30 winters. It was the child reading aloud while the grown-ups rested their eyes. It was the neighbor who checked your roof after a storm. The one who brought broth when your hands were too tired to cook. These things didn't make headlines. They didn't fill books. But they built a life. They turned hardship into home, cold into closeness. Because winter was not something they fought. It was something they lived through, together. And as the last logs settled into ash, as the snow thinned, as birds returned, so did the knowledge that they had made it through again. Not with noise, not with grand victories, but with patience, and presence, and love. When the ice on the creek finally broke, and the ground softened enough to walk without sinking, it was time to wash. Not the small daily cloths hung near the hearth, but the full bundles, bedsheets, heavy woolens, aprons and trousers with winter's soot and smoke in their threads. The women gathered by the water, sometimes alone, sometimes with neighbors, arms full of linens and pale soap carved from last year's lard and lye. The creek water was cold, bitterly so. But the sun was warmer now, and that made the work feel bearable, even sweet. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed on boards, rinsed in eddies where the water swirled clear and fast. Knuckles turned red. Sleeves grew damp. But there was a kind of satisfaction in it. The rhythm of slap and rinse. The smell of soap and early moss. The rustle of wind through bare branches. Later, back home, lines were strung between trees. Clothes flapped gently in the breeze, like flags of survival. The sun dried them slowly. The air left them stiff but clean. And as the sheets were folded that evening, still smelling faintly of water and wind, the house felt lighter. Like winter was finally loosening its hold. It happened quietly, so quietly some people missed it. The trees began to whisper again. Not the stark groan of winter wind, but something softer, like a breath returning. Buds appeared first, tiny, tentative, like thoughts not yet fully formed. You had to lean close to see them. Touch them gently with your fingertips. Maple, birch, willow, all waking slowly from long sleep. The forest floor, once frozen and hard, grew spongy with melt. Moss crept out from under stones. In some spots, tiny purple crocus dared to rise, trembling, uncertain, but alive. The birds came back one by one. First just their calls, carried through the woods like memory. Then their wings, flickering across fences, flitting from branch to branch. Inside, people noticed. They opened shutters in the morning. Let light fall across the kitchen table. Set out seed for the birds, just a handful, just enough. And for the first time in many weeks, the house smelled not just of smoke and stew, but of new air. It smelled like beginning. Spring didn't just bring green, it brought movement. The animals, too, were stirring. The cow, once reluctant to step outside, now stood in the sun near the barn, swishing her tail slowly, patiently. The chickens clucked louder, braver, their feathers fuller from the winter's rest. The goats danced, truly danced, little kicks and skips as they bounded over the muddy yard. Children laughed when they saw it. They ran beside them, not to chase, but to join in the joy. Even the horses seemed lighter, their breath no longer a puff of frost. Feeding time grew easier. No more breaking ice to fill the trough. No more hauling frozen bales in stiff gloves. Now the grass was returning, slow, thin, but green. And though they still offered grain, it felt like giving less and receiving more. Inside the barn, new life stirred. Tiny chicks under warm straw. A lamb tucked against its mother. The air smelled of hay again, not the dry, tired kind, but the fresh promise of spring. The animals knew it before the people did. They felt it in their hooves and bones. That the hard part was over, and something softer had begun. As the land woke, so did the people. But not all at once. It was a slow return. A soft one, like waking from a deep, satisfying sleep. They began to walk farther, to the edge of the property, down the familiar paths now dappled in melt. Boots left deeper prints now. Not from snow, but from mud. Children laughed louder. Chores took a little longer, interrupted by pauses to look at clouds, or birds, or tiny ants crawling across a warm stone. Neighbors passed each other on the road again. "Nice day," they'd say. And it was. Nice not just in the weather, but in the feeling of moving forward. Garden beds were cleared. Seeds selected. Tools oiled and mended. It wasn't yet time to plant, but it was time to dream. To imagine tomatoes again, and tall stalks of corn, and squash whose blossoms opened in morning light. Each task was still done slowly, but now the slowness felt different. Not from the cold, but from contentment. There was no rush, only the quiet joy of returning. As the air softened, the house changed. One by one, the signs of winter were gathered up, folded, and put away. Wool blankets, the heavy ones that had lined every bed, were shaken out and stored in trunks. The hearth tools were cleaned and set aside. The fire still burned on cool nights, but smaller now. More for comfort than necessity. Mittens were washed. Scarves hung to dry for the last time. Boots scrubbed with care and left near the door to dry in the gentle sun. Children gathered the leftover candle stubs, stacking them in neat towers. Too small to use now, but not to be thrown away. They'd be melted down come summer and poured into new forms. Ashes were scooped from the fireplace, not in a rush, but reverently. The smell of the house changed. Less of smoke, more of breeze. Less of soup, more of fresh bread, herbs, and warm earth. And as the rooms grew brighter and windows were opened wide for the first time in months, it felt like something old had gently been put to rest. Not discarded, not forgotten, but thanked and let go. Winter was never easy, but it left behind something more than cold. It left memory. Of stories shared in low voices, of mittens passed hand to hand, of soup ladled carefully from pot to bowl. It left the sound of wind tapping at windows, and the glow of candles flickering against paneled walls. It left the warmth of knowing that even in the hardest months, they had been held by something bigger than themselves. By each other, by the fire, by quiet endurance. And though it had passed, winter still lived inside the people. In the way they touched the woodpile, or felt the grain sack for holes, or sat a little longer near the fire, even when the sun was high. Not in fear, but in respect, because they had made it through. And that meant something, in a way only they could understand. The people of that time, they knew how to wait. They didn't expect comfort every day. They didn't demand ease. They welcomed the hard seasons, not with celebration, but with steadiness, because they knew the world turned in circles. After spring came summer, then harvest, then the slow curl into winter again. And so each season was lived with care. The joys savored, the hardships endured, nothing wasted. Even the hardest days gave something in return. And as the sun grew stronger and birds made nests under eaves, the people didn't forget winter. They simply folded it into their lives like a story, like a well-used quilt, worn, familiar, and cherished. Not everything in life is soft, but when we meet it gently, it becomes gentler. And what remains, after the snow has melted and the fires have gone quiet, is not just survival. It is grace. Let's imagine one more night. A peaceful, ordinary night at the edge of spring. The fire is low, but still glowing. Just enough to cast light across the wooden floor. The shutters are open now. A breeze stirs the curtains. You can hear the owls calling from the edge of the woods. Inside, the house is quiet. A candle flickers on the table. The quilts are folded. The books are put away. The kettle hums faintly. Someone stirs in their bed upstairs. A soft creak. Then stillness. You can almost feel the warmth of the linen sheets, the soft weight of blankets pulled up to your chin. Outside, the stars blink gently above a world that is slowly beginning again. But inside, for now, all is still. The season has passed. You have rested. And now, there is nothing left to do but sleep. Good night. If you listen closely, even the stones remember. The ones that line the path behind the house, that mark the edges of old cellars, long gone to moss and quiet. They've seen every winter. They felt every thaw. They were there when boots pressed into mud, when children skipped between puddles, when someone cried alone by the well. They hold no judgment, only memory. You might kneel by one, brush the lichen away, and feel the cold, solid truth beneath your fingers. A kind of wisdom, without words. A patience that never asks for anything in return. In the oldest parts of the land, stones hold stories deeper than any quilt, older than any journal. And sometimes, without even meaning to, you place your hand on one and feel seen. Not in a loud way, but in a long way. Later in spring, when the days grew long and the shadows leaned into evening, the grass began to move. Not just grow, but move. The wind played across it like a gentle hand. You could sit beside the field for hours, just watching it bend and breathe. The tall blades whispered like voices you almost understood. They said, "This land has seen much. This land is still here." Children laid in it, looking up. Hats pulled over their faces, arms flung wide. Farmers walked through it, slowly, deliberately, feeling how the world gave back what had been waited for. The grass was not perfect. It grew in patches. It tangled and twisted. But it was alive. And it reminded everyone who saw it that time, no matter how slow, always moved forward. The wind in the grass didn't ask for your attention. But if you gave it, it gave something back. Most hours passed slowly. There was no ticking clock in every room. No bells marking every quarter of the day. Instead, time moved like molasses in January. Like sun across the table. Like bread rising in a warm oven. You didn't miss anything. Because nothing ever really left. It just shifted. From morning to noon. From noon to dusk. From dusk to dreams. Children didn't ask, "What time is it?" They asked, "Is it light enough to go outside? Is it time to eat? Can I stay up until the fire is out?" The hours belonged to people, not machines. They folded themselves into stories, into chores, into rest. You could lie down for a while, and no one would call it lazy. You could stare out the window and call it prayer. In those hours, unhurried, unclaimed, the world became something softer, something forgiving, something like sleep. There were always soft things, even in hard winters. Wool socks with worn heels. A cat curled tight in a basket of rags. Bread crusts dipped in honey water. A hand on your shoulder when you didn't ask. The softness of the wooden floor under bare feet, even in the cold. The softness of your own breath against a window pane. The softness of your name, spoken kindly once. Softness did not mean weakness. It meant choosing quiet when you could have chosen noise. It meant patience when the fire didn't start. It meant letting someone cry without needing to fix it. The world was full of edges. Stone and frost and wood and wind. But it was also full of things that cradled you. Things that didn't need to prove anything. They just existed to comfort. Like the sound of boiling water. Or the smell of flour. Or this very moment where nothing needs to be done and you are allowed fully to rest. Now, everything begins to slow. The story has been told. The hearth has dimmed. The pages have turned. You are warm. You are still. The wind outside no longer matters. The world can go on turning, gently, gently, while you remain exactly where you are. Every blink slower, every breath softer. You are not in a cabin anymore. You are floating. In your own bed, yes, but also beyond it. In the stillness between stars. In the hush beneath snow. In the quiet part of the fire, the part that glows, not burns. Let the weight of blankets hold you. Let your thoughts drift like chimney smoke. There's nothing more to do now. You are safe. You are good. You are home. Sleep. The fire has gone quiet now. Just warm, dim embers, pulsing slowly, like the heart of the house still beating. You feel the bed beneath you. Not a colonial bed anymore. Just yours. Still and safe. The sheets hold your shape. The pillow cradles your cheek. A breeze moves somewhere far away. You don't need to follow it. There is no more to see. No more to carry. The room is gentle. The night is long. Your breath is soft. The covers rise and fall. Far off, an owl calls once. Then silence again. You hear the tick of cooling wood. The slow hush of wind against glass. The faintest scent of something sweet, smoke and wool, and a memory you don't need to name. Everything slows. Your hands are heavy. Your chest is warm. Your face is slack and peaceful. There is only this stillness, this moment, this quiet, this comfort. Let go now. You've made it through. The winter is behind you. The hearth is low. The stars are watching. And sleep is already here.